Hi everybody, in this video I'll be looking at my round 8 game of the Cherry Blossom Classic. I'm playing International Master Thomas Bartell, and I have the black pieces. So, yeah, the game started off with e4, c6, so I was pretty consistent in playing my Caro-Kann against e4 in this tournament, and yeah, so this game, I wasn't really sure what to expect, but he ended up playing the exchange variation with bishop d3. And this is sometimes known as the Fischer variation also, because I think Bobby Fischer liked to play this way a lot against the Caro-Kann, and would usually play bishop f4, bishop d3, just develop this way. And the line that I actually like here is with queen c7 really early, so this is specifically designed against bishop f4. And, okay, at this point, yeah, my opponent played one of the main lines, knight e2, and I like this move bishop g4 here. He ended up playing one of the lines that was not really that critical here. He played f3, which is a perfectly logical move because, well, bishop g4 is directed against, or bishop g4 is directed against him developing bishop f4. And so f3 makes a lot of sense to just chase this bishop away and then play bishop f4. But actually, yeah, it turns out it's not really the most testing way for it to play. Like, I think the other main line here is castles, and well, white has a pretty sneaky idea here to play queen e1, with actually the idea to play f3 and then queen h4 to go chasing this bishop down. And I mean, there may be some other ways that white can play this too. So something like this I would have been prepared for. But actually f3, yeah, since it's not as critical a line, I didn't actually know it very well. And I think here I make a very, very slight inaccuracy. There's two main lines for black here, like black can retreat the bishop to d7 or put the bishop on h5. And I think they're both pretty much fine. They're both definitely playable. But bishop d7, I think, is maybe slightly easier for black to play, which I didn't really know at the time. Like I just thought, okay, I'll just play bishop h5, bishop d6, and it should be about equal. And yeah, I think this would be about equal, except for one plan that white has here. So in the game he played bishop f4, which is not really testing at all. The queen will just move, and then I'm going to play bishop g6 next move, trade off the light squared bishops, and black basically has no problems. But yeah, during the game I was thinking if white plays knight f4, well yeah, this may be something he can do, because he's hitting the pawn and the bishop. I have to play knight f6, defending both. And it looks like white can go pawn hunting here with a move like g4 and g5. That's not actually so dangerous for black. Basically, it's just going to take way too much time, and this knight can just move out of the way. Like, if you take this pawn, the queen will just move out of the way, and black is ready to play e5. Okay, you can even castle queenside, and basically white's position is just too overextended. So, like, for example, something like even knight f4 right away, black can play e5. And if you take on h5, bishop takes, then we have a lot of pressure on d4. If you take on e5, the knight will take, hitting the bishop, hitting the pawn. So I mean, something like this is not really something that black has to be worried about. But actually, yeah, according to Leela, analyzing this position a little bit, white can be pretty annoying with this move knight takes h5 and set up this bind after g3. Very important move, and then to play f4. So, for example, after e6, f4, the knight is hit, so then we'll come back to f6. And then white's just going to play this like knight d2, and then knight f3 and knight e5. So I don't actually think this has been seen in any like high-level games. I was only able to find one master game in the database where white played this way, and I mean, white can easily get a very good position just by simply putting the knight here on e5 and playing with a bishop pair. All the pawns on dark squares are very useful for restricting black's remaining bishop. So yeah, I mean, white can get a very comfortable edge this way. And I think for that reason here, it's probably more accurate to just play bishop d7. This is the kind of the secondary main line. I think actually bishop d7 is more common than bishop h5 anyway, but they're both considered to be fine for black, but bishop d7 probably should be considered most fine for black. So the idea is actually we're going to play for e5, and after bishop f4, black right away plays e5. And we don't mind going into this isolated pawn position because white has played f3. So this is just going to give black extra tactical options because this diagonal is open, we oftentimes have a timely queen d6 check. And also, when our bishop appears on this diagonal, like it's not really harmonious for it to play f3 and h3. Oftentimes the pawn on h2 can become a target. So like something like this, castles on bishop d6, it's basically just equal. Like this is completely playable for black. Black can even think about castling queenside in these kind of positions, and that's just fine. So yeah, I think for the future probably bishop d7 would be my preference. But okay, after bishop h5, he plays bishop f4, and now, yeah, this is also just equal, so I play queen d7. I didn't want to play queen d6 because of queen d3, and I don't really want to make this exchange, but at the same time, I'm not sure I want to let white take here and give myself these weakened b-pawns over here. So yeah, queen d7 is fine. Plays bishop g3, so now he wants to play knight f4, but before he does that, I play bishop g6, knight f4, and I can just trade these bishops. And yeah, during the game, I felt like this is just equal, which is correct. Plays knight d2, bishop d6, queen e2. He's kind of curiously delaying castling here. I think he's still hoping for me to take this bishop, which would let him open up the h-file. So for now, it's not something that I'm planning to do. And here, my last decision was where to develop this knight. And I thought e7 was the most reasonable square, just because it looks like it has more options to go to than f6. On f6, it's just restricted by this pawn on f3. I think both developments are probably just fine. But actually, yeah, I kind of misunderstood how to play this position for black. So he takes on d6, and white's plan is very obvious here, so he plays f4. And he basically wants to develop some kind of kingside attack, like plop a knight on e5, later castle, and basically play on this side of the board over here. So he might easily do a rook lift later. The rook comes up to f3, over to h3. And because of this looming pressure on the king side, black actually needs to think very carefully about where we want the king. We definitely actually don't want the king on the queen side, because white will also be able to easily open up lines over there and just send these pawns going. And yeah, the queen side's not really going to be that safe. I ended up castling kingside, which actually is a pretty significant inaccuracy. And again, here Leela actually shows it shows the correct way for black to play here, which is actually very instructive. So the best move is actually h5 for black, which seems rather strange. I mean, you'd think if we're going to castle kingside, then why are we playing h5? We're not going to castle the queen side, so what exactly are we doing with the king? Well, the point of h5 is actually to stop white from gaining space with g4 on the king side. So if black had castled, like in the game, I castled, and actually what would have been a very strong way for white to play would be to play g4. He started with castles, which is also just fine, and yeah, you can start with g4, and then you have this idea that sometimes play f5, or to just do a rook lift. With this pawn on g4, you could always meet h6 with g5, opening up the h-file. So okay, h5 is basically prophylaxis against all of that. After castles, Leela just plays g6. Just basically says I have a very solid pawn wall over here on the king side. And after rook e1, it finally answers the question, what are you going to do with the king? It doesn't castle. It doesn't castle this way. It just plays king f8. Knight f3, and then puts the king on g7. And surprisingly, after just a couple more natural moves, so I played a couple of moves out here, after g3, rook e8, black's position is actually slightly better here. And the reason is, white is kind of all out of improving moves. He's developed all his pieces, he's put the knight on e5, but he has no pawn breaks to make further progress. Any of these pawn breaks, like g4 or c4, are just going to weaken his position. You play c4, you're going to weaken the d4 pawn. If you play g4, that's really just going to open up the h-file for black, so this rook on h8 is perfectly placed. But meanwhile, black does have a very concrete plan. We can play f6 to chase this knight away, and then later we can think about maneuvering a knight to e4. So we could play queen c7, then knight d6, knight e4. And black also can slowly think about some kind of minority attack over here on the queen side in the future. So this kind of position actually is strategically just better for black. Like it's not a huge advantage. It's just kind of a slight plus, I would say. But yeah, definitely this kind of structure. I mean, you can get it with either color. And it seems like kind of a stonewall formation that white is trying to set up here. So this way of playing is very instructive for black, just to set up this kind of pawn blockade, and most importantly, not castling the king too early, just letting the king sit on g7 so that this rook can stay on the h-file. So in the future, it'll definitely be good to know that alternative plan. Instead, what I did was castle, and now this does get to be a little bit dangerous. So he castles, g4 right away would also have been quite strong. And yeah, kind of around here, I started realizing that I wasn't too happy with my earlier decisions here, because, I mean, white does have this very simple plan, just attack me on the king side. And I thought for 10 minutes here, this is kind of my first big think of the game, and I ended up playing king h8, which, it's okay. It's definitely not the best move, but it's kind of a strange prophylaxis. I wanted to play knight g8 and knight f6, at least have that option, so that I could put something in the e4 square, or at least force white to keep a knight passive, defending that square. If I have a knight on f6, I'll always be threatening to jump into e4. And yeah, kind of around here, I was wishing I had played knight f6 earlier, so back a few moves ago, in this position where I was trying to decide where to put my knight, both squares are actually totally fine. Like if you play knight e7, and then you follow it up with this plan of g6 h5, then black is fine. And knight f6 is actually also fine. And there, like, you can, after the same way that white plays, then you can right away maneuver this knight over here to f5, and then it'll later go to d6, and then use the e4 square. So it turns out both developments of the knight would have been fine, just the main question was what to do with the black king. So that was the question that I was not able to answer correctly. Okay, so yeah, anyway, yeah, we got to this position, played king h8, and now he just continues to make natural moves, rook e1, and yeah, then around here I started going for counterplay, so I think b5 is a good move. He doesn't really have any immediate threats just yet, and I'm not really able to get this same ideal defensive formation anymore with my rook on h8. It's just going to take too long to set up, and he's going to crash through with g4, like, long before I can even achieve that kind of structure. So yeah, I thought I need to get counterplay over here. And if white kind of switches gears, like a very typical way to react to a minority attack is to play it like this with b4, or at least to set up something like a3, a5, b4. This will lock down the c5 square. I thought this would be okay, so like I was waiting for him to move his rook off of the a file. Now I could open that up and play something like rook a2. I thought around here black would have good enough counterplay, not to be at least too much worse. And the engine mostly agrees here. White might still be a little bit better, but it's not like white doesn't have a free hand over here on the king side. Yeah, and instead he did just decide to ignore me. Since it's going to start moving his pieces over here to attack me. Yeah, so I continued b4, knight g5. And the principle of defense, when you're kind of playing in this situation where black is trying to make progress over here on the queen side, and white is trying to checkmate me on the king side, is you generally don't want to make moves on this side of the board where you're defending, unless you have to react to a direct threat. So, like, you know, king h8 was just kind of a prophylactic move. It turns out that probably was not very necessary. But yeah, I mean, here b5, white wasn't making any threats. Knight f3, there's no threat, so I play b4. After knight g5, there is a threat. He's threatening queen h5, which is then going to be either checkmate or he's going to be able to take on f7. So here I do need to make some kind of reaction. I can't just continue like b takes c3 because of queen h5. And then if I defend checkmate, he's going to be able to take on f7. And at least win the exchange. So yeah, here I pretty much have choice between h6 and g6. I played g6, which I think in human terms is probably the correct reaction. The engine does prefer h6, but I was just kind of too scared about allowing this position. He can play queen h5, threatening knight takes f7, so I'll play king g8. Okay, so I mean here it kind of makes sense that king h8 to g8 was just a loss of a tempo. And I was just worried that white could leave the knight sitting on g5, play something like rook f3. I can't ever take this. At least I strongly doubt I can ever take it. Because after rook h3, like, I might not be getting checkmated right away after f6, but like white can still just, I mean, just open up my king, and at any moment he can start to like play queen h7 check. Like if I take here, then maybe queen queen h7 check, then rook f1 check. It just looked too dangerous. So, I mean, yeah, I guess there may not be a direct win right away, but something like this just looked too dangerous to allow. And the engine here just says there's like no threats and says, oh, you just take on c3, and then apparently play some move like queen d8, which is definitely far from obvious. Apparently the idea is to play queen e8, and then I suppose you're gonna somehow be able to use this diagonal to defend. So anyway, yeah, this is kind of the engine way of playing the position. The human way is just to play g6. So we stop queen h5. And like around here, I realized that I want to play king g7 and then h5, and that would basically be the ideal defensive formation. And with rook on h8, that we could have gotten like from 5 moves ago. But yeah, it was only now that I kind of realized that this is what I want. And yeah, here he starts to kind of play not the most testing moves. He was playing very quickly up until this point, so he was not really taking that much time on his moves. And he played knight e5 fairly quickly, which is still fine. He could have been even more incisive, I think, with g4, which just kind of right away thinks about playing f5, or you can execute a rook lift like this. g4, yeah, is just a very good space gaining move there. Knight e5, yeah, looks very attractive because you're making this double attack on f7. But actually after knight d8, which I was anticipating, there's no sacrifices yet, and now at least black can think about playing f6, which is going to win a piece. So like white has to take some care there that black can't get away with this. So here he had a really long think. He thought for half an hour, and I was feeling fairly confident at this point. Like I still didn't see what the direct threat was, and I was expecting him to play queen g4 and then queen h3. He ended up playing something similar. He played queen d3 to h3, and then oops, not queen a6. And my plan against that would have been to play king g7, then after queen h3 to play h6. And like here I was calculating all sorts of sacrifices on f7 or g6 or e6, and they do work here. Like they're playable, but I didn't see like that anything was winning. It'll be like you're going to trade off 2 knights for a rook and some pawns. So yeah, but then while I was thinking here, I realized he has a very strong move f5, which luckily he did not play. The engine does confirm this is a pretty strong move, and the point is if I play knight takes f5, then g4 is just really dangerous. Like if I actually just move this knight, white is winning on the spot with queen f2, threatening queen f6 check, or queen h4, and like if I play f6, then queen h4, just ignoring these knights, like black's position falls apart here. After king g7, there's just sacrifice on h7, rook takes f6. Like white is crashing through here. If we trade rooks, then I have no way to guard the g6 pawn, and black's position basically falls apart here. So I probably would have to play e takes f5 here, but then I saw you could play knight takes g6 check, and I can technically try this, knight takes g6. If I just play h takes, then white's idea is to trade off into a pretty good endgame. Like white's not winning here, but it's definitely a clear advantage with this really active rook. My d5 pawn is isolated. All of my pieces are just kind of passive on the back rank, so this is just good for white. And yeah, if I play knight takes g6, I didn't really see the checkmate after this. I have to play king g7 and put my king on f6. I didn't see how I was getting mated, but I just assumed that the king was not going to survive on f6, and indeed, this is not going to end very well. White has a very strong move, queen h6, which sets up some nasty rook sacrifice on f5. It's really just defending the knight, so like black has no defense, basically. If you play rook h8, then rook takes f5, and rook f1. It's going to lead to very bad things happening for the black king. So yeah, f5 was definitely a pretty big miss for him. There was actually later a second point during the game he could have played f5, and it would have been even stronger than here. So yeah, we still have quite a few adventures left to go in this game. So yeah, instead he played what I was expecting, queen d3 or queen g4. It's the same. After king g7, he puts the queen on h3, h6, and yeah, this I was all expecting. He sacrifices on f7. And here, black has a choice, basically, between playing rook takes f7 and then allowing knight takes f7. We'll have to take with a king, otherwise the e6 pawn will hang. It's like rook takes f7, knight takes f7, king takes f7, and queen takes h6. So you have a choice between that position or playing knight takes f7, which then allows knight takes e6. The king will move, white takes on f8, and after rook takes, can play rook e6. And there is actually, like, one of those is much better than the other, and I didn't pick the correct one here. I played knight takes f7, and really I think I just misevaluated this position. Knight takes e6, king h7. After he takes on f8 and plays rook e6, white is probably close to winning here, just because you already have two pawns and the rook for the two knights, and it's actually a little bit more concrete than that too, because white can actually force, kind of force a queen trade after I move my queen away. At least he can play like queen h4 and force this knight away. I mean, even if white does not force a queen trade, like, yeah, the rooks are going to be too active here. So, I mean, this happened at the game, we'll see. But, yeah, I should point out he missed a win right away here with f5. Like, we both missed this. The point is, if I play knight takes f5, you can just take it, and you win back your piece, you're still attacking. I can't take this because then I just got checkmated. Like, wherever my king goes, you're going to play either queen f6 or queen g6 with checkmate. So, yeah, that would not be good. And if I can't take it, then, like, basically I have to allow this line, except it's even worse, because now the 6th rank is open, and, like, white can just play this slowly. He can just double in will. He's going to play, after this knight moves, he can play queen h5 and mate on g6. Even like rook f6 and the other rook coming down to e6 is just going to be totally brutal, with my king getting hit from all sides with all of white's major pieces. So that was definitely a big miss from him, playing f5. And that was why, yeah, in this position, I should have taken with the rook on f7. Unfortunately, you have to see a very important plan for black, because this position, after queen takes h6, this is actually winning for white, except for one idea that black has. Just intuitively, I sensed that this was way too dangerous. Like, white is going to play g4 and f5 in a couple moves, and my king is going to get totally destroyed here. But, yeah, black can play the brilliant king e8. This is just kind of a Petrosian-style king march, and actually, this is just unclear. Like, the king is going to end up on d7, where he's actually very safe. And at the end of the day, black does still have two knights, and if one of them can make it to the e4 square, then I mean, even black could be better in a position like that. So even though white has two pawns, so yeah, this would just be very complex. I'm not sure how to evaluate this, but as long as my king is safe, that's kind of the number one priority there. Is if my king is safe, then strategically the rest of my position is going to be okay. So yeah, that would have been the right way to play this position. Yeah, instead I did not see this play, and I'm playing king e8 to d7. And yeah, instead I entered this line. So yeah, he misses f5. What he does is still very good, but he has to be a little more precise here. So like I thought for a long time here, realizing that this is actually not so good for me. Like I thought my king, as long as my king would be okay, safe from the immediate danger, then the position would be playable. So kind of like having the king on d7 would be safe. I thought the king on h7 was like kind of safe. It is not getting checkmated right away there, but it would definitely be much safer over here on d7 with this pawn on e6. So like the main difference is, yeah, we would basically have this pawn on h6 over here on e6. The king would be sheltered over here on the center. So yeah, I played queen d8. There's really nothing better. And white does have to be accurate here. So he kind of played the autopilot move here. He was still playing fairly quickly. Like apart from that one move where he thought for 30 minutes, he played all of his moves basically in like, I mean, within 2 or 3 minutes, sometimes like just less than 1 minute he played them. So yeah, and here he very quickly played rook fe1, which actually turns out to be a big mistake. This lets black right back into the game. White should play something like queen h4. And the point is we're actually just entering an endgame. So if this knight moves, then white is actually very happy to trade queens, and not take on b4 right away, because then the d4 pawn hangs, but just play g4. It seems counterintuitive to chase this knight to where it wants to go, but white just has too many pawns. Take on b4, and this is already 3 pawns, and a rook for the 2 knights. Like, materially, white's winning here. I can get a knight to e4, but white has too many pawns. This rook is going to go to a6. I have still these weaknesses over here. This other rook is not going to be very far away from invading. So, yeah, I mean, black can still resist here, but objectively this should be winning for white. Yeah, instead he played something that looked very good. He played rook fe1, and I'm sure he had his next move planned out after this. So this I had anticipated here. Like, I thought in this position for 18 minutes, and I was kind of anticipating all of this, that he would play rook fe1. And after knight f5, I saw he can take on g6, which is what happened. And this looks at first glance very strong for white. E6 check, king g7, queen takes f5, because this looks like a pretty devastating threat to just go to g6, either with a rook or the queen. But actually black has this very nice defensive move, knight h8, which I remember he looked kind of shocked when I played this move, so maybe this is something that he missed in his calculations. And this is in fact the only good move for black. If you don't play knight h8, then basically white is going to play something to g6, and that's not going to be very good. So yeah, now for knight h8, black has an extra knight, so it's a piece for 3 pawns, and my king is not getting checkmated right away. So this actually just becomes unclear. So like he plays queen e5 check, I play rook f6, and I was most worried about him actually entering the endgame. So like he could play rook e8, forcing my queen to d6, and then trade queens, and then take on b4. He has 4 pawns for the knight now, but at least by taking on b4, he's had to shatter his pawn structure here. So this d pawn is isolated. These doubled pawns really kind of count as 1 pawn, and yeah, white is better here. I think it should be holdable for black, but I thought this would probably be the strongest way for white to play. But yeah, I can't really fault him for doing what he did. He played f5, which is very logical, and then he's basically just playing to keep the queens on the board. And for king h7, he plays h4. So he basically just says, you know, your move. You can't take this pawn on f5 because of queen g6 check. And if you take on e6, you're going to let my pawn get to e6, and that's going to be very dangerous. So this pawn combined with a queen and my open king is going to make it quite tough for black to move around. So yeah, I wasn't sure how to evaluate this position. I just felt it was unclear, which I think is the correct assessment. It's definitely harder to play for black. Like, white is not really risking much and can make a perpetual check pretty much whenever he wants. White's king is very safe, and yeah, it's not so easy for black. So we both had about the same amount of time here. Like, he had 41 minutes, and I had 39 minutes after my next move. So yeah, now we just have to play this position, and yeah, definitely there are still quite a lot of back and forth moments that both of us missed here. Okay, so yeah, I took on c3, and then I decided that it's just going to simplify my life if I release this tension here and never have to worry about him taking here at some point. And even though this allows his pawn to e6, I thought my knight can go to d6, and later I even have this play on knight c8, and then the knight will blockade on e7. So I pretty much have, like, my main weakness that I have to worry about is d5, and also a7. d5 is going to be more vulnerable because the queen can attack it very easily. And I thought if my knight is on e7, as long as the queen is in contact with the knight, this e-pawn will be finely blockaded, and the knight also defends d5, then all I have to make sure is that, like, my queen is defending the a7 pawn. Shouldn't be that hard. And yeah, my king is exposed, but white's not going to checkmate me with just a queen. So even if he advances his pawn to h5, like, I would have to be mildly worried about losing the h6 pawn, but the nice thing about having the knight on e7 is I can also come back to g8 and defend the pawn on h6. So yeah, I was kind of feeling like my position is defendable here. And the engine just says this is 0-0-0, which doesn't really mean a draw. It just means like white has compensation for the piece. It's just knight for 3 pawns. So yeah, so he plays queen e5, but this is still really hard for black to play. Like in this position, I actually make a losing move here, which my opponent does not properly punish. I play knight to c8 with this idea of knight e7, but actually the problem is white can play a series of checks and forcing moves to actually get his queen to d7. If white could teleport the queen to d7 right here, that would be winning because you're going to take the pawn on d5 and I wouldn't be able to trade queens. And you can actually do that. You can play queen f5 check, king h8, and I think the move that neither of us considered in this position, queen f4. Very strong move, attacking the h6 pawn. The point being that after the king comes back to defend, now you play queen f7 check, and you're going to get to d7 with tempo. So king h8, queen d7, and now I can't trade queens, I have to move away, but then white takes on d5. This should be winning for white now, with 3 connected pass pawns in the center. So yeah, we both missed that. Instead of this, yeah, black kind of has to give up on this idea of playing knight c8 and just play knight e8. And then after g3, knight g7, basically black can argue that you have a fortress here. Like, we can put the pawn in h5, and then the engine just literally shuffles the king back and forth between g6 and h7 and says white has no way to break through, which I do kind of believe. Like, this queen, if it ever moves too far away, black might just be able to take this pawn on e6. And d5 is not going to fall anytime soon. Like, this queen can stay here. Even if you play e7, the queen can go to d7, and the queen and knight together are holding the queen and scoring e8. So, yeah, this defensive formation with a knight on g7 would have been more resilient. And the difficulty with doing this is black literally has to like sit and do nothing. So, I wasn't sure during the game if I could establish a fortress like that. So psychologically, it's just kind of hard to just sit and do nothing and hope that your opponent has no way to break your defenses. But yeah, according to the engine, that would be holding. So yeah, instead I play knight c8. He doesn't see queen f5 check in this little maneuver to get to d7. So instead he plays g3. And yeah, now black is okay again. So now I get my knight to e7. Now black is fine. So queen f6, queen d6. You can get the queen to f7, but I just play king h8. And okay, he just starts to make slow improving moves, get his king up the board. And now my knight goes to g8. So my idea now is my king is safe from checks, the h6 pawn is secure, and I'm ready to go off with my queen for some counterplay. So like given a move, I'll play queen a6, when I could either take on a2 with check, play queen e2 check, try to make some perpetual. And yeah, white doesn't have to think about this. So like if he just takes on a7, then I'll be very happy to take on e6. This a pawn is going to be very far away from becoming dangerous, and my queen is going to be ready to start playing perpetual. So he plays a good practical move here. He plays king h3. Once again, like if he plays even queen d7, I'm not going to trade queens. I would play queen a6 now, getting ready to play queen e2 check. And even if you take on d5, like this is just perpetual, queen e2 check. But one of the main points is that if you ever go to g4, this is actually a very funny checkmate. Like the queen and king, or the queen, knight, and pawn take away all the squares from white's king. So again, instead he plays king h3. And yeah, I mean, this is kind of an unpleasant move to face, because you're just realizing like white is kind of passing and waiting for black to do something. It's kind of hard for me to just shuffle around. Like I didn't want to just go back and forth with my knight like this. I was worried that white could then slowly play like h5, maybe even get a couple steps closer with the king, or play like g4, g5. So I decided I wanted to go right away for some kind of counterplay, get my queen to a3. And I'm still in contact with the e7 square. I'm still defending the a7 pawn. But now he switches back, he plays queen f5. He's going after the d5 pawn. And yeah, kind of at this point, the first move I considered was queen c1, with this idea to play queen h1 check and try to just force a perpetual. And I calculated this for a while, and what I calculated was correct. But yeah, for some reason, like I got too locked into this one move. I didn't actually consider queen takes c3, which I kind of, it's just easy to reject because you don't even have a check in the position, and it just seems like you're going to let white take here, or you're going to play queen e5 check and then play e7. Had I considered this move, I think it would have been fairly obvious for me to see that like this is just a draw. Like if queen takes d5, black just plays queen e1, and we have the same construction going on with queen f1 check. If the king would go to g4, the knight f6 would be mate. The e7 pawn, or the e pawn, is not dangerous at all, like the queen and knight easily guard it. If you play queen e5 check, this is not really dangerous, we just trade queens, and then the knight is going to blockade these pawns, and king g7, even white has to be careful in an endgame like this, because none of his pawns are really dangerous. And yeah, I think maybe a little bit harder to see if you play queen e5 check and then e7. I think this is what I was just not wanting to allow. Black is lost here except for one simple resource. You can actually play queen c8 check. And for king g2, queen e8, all of a sudden it transpires that this pawn on e7 is lost. And after white loses this pawn, actually it is white who has to be careful here. Like, I took the pawn on c3, so now white only has 2 pawns for the knight. And even if we take on d5, and I'll take on e7, like, it's still 2 pawns for the knight, and now, I mean, none of white's pawns are really super dangerous, so yeah, black actually has real winning chances here. So yeah, queen takes c3 would have probably forced like an immediate draw. Probably white would have just taken on d5, and then after queen e1 allowed some perpetual. Like even, I mean, you can't really escape anywhere with your king. Like obviously you can't go here right away because we made a 6 check. And yeah, even if you move the queen, like it doesn't matter, queen f1 check. And you still can't go to g4 because this is just checkmate. And otherwise we have a very straightforward perpetual like this. So yeah, queen takes c3 would have been simpler. Instead I just kind of, yeah, I got too caught up in this move, and the line that I calculated was very funny, which, yeah, maybe was like part of the reason why I felt like I should go for it. Objectively, this is still holding for black, but it makes my life much more complicated. So he plays the most testing way, queen e5 check, king h7 and e7. And yeah, here I saw that I have this resource, queen f1 check. And now to avoid perpetual, he has to play king g4. And now my point is queen f7. So I'm going to force the knight endgame. So we're going to trade queens. I'm attacking this pawn. He has to promote. And now, yeah, temporarily white is like a queen ahead, but I can trade queens and I'll play knight f6 check. King f5, knight takes e8. Now, this endgame looks unclear. Like, I felt during the game, I actually felt like this might just still be winning for white. But yeah, I wanted to kind of force the issue and just go for a knight endgame without the queens on the board. Yeah, I mean, if I did want to force the issue, like back in this position, again, I should have just played, I should have at least considered queen takes e3. And I'm sure I would have been able to calculate that with this queen e1 trick or with this queen c8 idea, that black would be okay. But yeah, I think it was just mostly that I didn't consider this move. Queen c1 was like the first move I considered, and once I calculated that I could get to this position, I thought, okay, fine, this is like playable, although it's still very dangerous. So he plays king e5 now. It's very important for him not to play king e6, because then after knight c7 and knight b5 check, I'll take on c3, and actually even worse, I can take on a2. So this is still a draw, but like white has to be careful there. So he plays king e5, and now at this point I was also getting into some time pressure. I think I still had 10 minutes on my clock here, but we have a choice between playing knight c7 to try and defend this pawn, or to start marching the king in, give this pawn away, and then hope that we can draw that resulting endgame. This resulting endgame, like after something like this, I wasn't really sure if white's winning here. I wasn't sure if black can draw, but just intuitively I felt like these pawns are going to be pretty dangerous, and white also has the potential, if my king gets wrapped up over here trying to stop these pawns, then at some moment white can play g4, and then just make a second pass pawn over here. So something like this I was kind of scared of. It turns out that this is a draw. It's actually very instructive to see how black draws this position. So like, white kind of needs to just start running his c pawn. This is the most testing way to play. And then black plays a very important move h5. So like for now, black is actually just waiting for white to advance these pawns. The king and knight are perfectly placed right now to later be able to stop these pawns. And what's going to happen is black can actually end up sacrificing the knight for these two pawns. And then what's going to end up happening is a pawn race where both sides will be trying to promote something. So like, white's king will go off to one side of the board to try and win my pawns, and I will go off to the other side of the board to either win these pawns or this pawn. And then in that resulting pawn race, like, we need to have our pawns as far advanced as possible. So after a5, let's say white plays king c6 now, to just try and get ready for this. If you play c7, then you're going to be stuck, because the knight on e8 perfectly controls the d6 and c7 squares, so after c6 you wouldn't be able to make progress. You'd have to go here to then push this pawn, but as soon as you play king c5 you'll allow my king to step in, and like after d5 check, the king settles on d6, and all of these squares are going to be nicely blockaded by the king and knight. So let's say after king c6, now black plays knight f6. So the threat is kind of king e6, which is going to freeze these pawns. So after d5, now a4, so once again, getting this pawn as far advanced as possible, d6, king e6. And this is kind of a good construction to know if you're playing with a knight versus a bunch of pawns. The king and knight together are actually freezing this whole construction that white has. Like, if it wasn't for this move a3, this would actually just be a very elementary draw. Like, if white had to move the king, then we would play king d5. And if you play c6, we have knight e8 check. We'll pick up one of the pawns. And if you play d7, we can just sacrifice the knight for both pawns. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. In this situation, the pawn race is basically going to be a draw. So both sides will be able to promote. I think, yeah, in some cases, white actually has to be a little bit careful that he's not losing the pawn race. So, yeah, in this case, white would play something like a3, just to waste a move. And then black has to just shuffle, so we can move the knight. And after d7, a7 check, the plan is just to keep shuffling. Like, if white just keeps moving back and forth, black doesn't mind. If you play king c8, we can still do this. Eventually, white has to make progress by playing king d8, and then black will again play knight e7, stopping c6. And then white will make progress by playing king e8, so threatening to promote. And yeah, basically, like, this would all be impossible to calculate from, like, however many moves ago it was, but this endgame winds up being a draw. So what's going to happen is black will take on c5, both kings are going to go to opposite sides of the board, and both sides will promote. White's going to end up with this h-pawn, and the resulting endgame, I think the table base confirms that this is a draw. And yeah, I don't really know the theory about when queen versus queen and pawn endgames are drawn or not. I think for the rook pawn, they're like easier to draw than if it's a center pawn, but that's may not actually be true. But yeah, anyway, this case happens to be a draw. I think if the pawn was further advanced, it probably would be better winning chances for white, but yeah, this would be a draw. And yeah, so basically, like, this endgame, it is holdable for black, like this kind of situation with knight versus 3 pawns, just with the kings on the board. So for the future, that probably is good to know. Also, you know, it looks like white can just advance these pawns at will, but actually, yeah, the knight is very well placed here to make white spend extra time to move the king and then march this pawn forward, and kind of showing this construction once more time, where black puts the knight on f6, and then later puts the king on e6. This is going to force white to spend some extra time, like force white to have this waiting move a3, because if these pawns didn't exist and white had to move, then this would be just a very easy hold for black. Like, white will have to end up losing both of these pawns for the knight after he moves the king somewhere, and then black plays king d5. So yeah, this construction is good to know, I think. So I'll try to remember that. And as it happened, yeah, back in this position, I did not want to go for that. Instead, I played knight c7. I have to say, yeah, what I did, this is probably one of the funniest knight maneuvers I've ever played in an actual game. So my point is basically you can't make progress like this because I'll play knight b5 check and then take on c3. So I was expecting a4. And then I had the very funny move knight a8 prepared, which this objectively actually loses. Like, in this position, knight c7 is a losing move. But it's actually still tricky. So after a4, knight a8, he was playing way too quickly here. Like, he definitely could have just taken some time. He had like 20 minutes at this point. He could have easily taken some time to just calculate precisely what the winning line was. It's not even that hard to calculate. He played a5 after like 4 minutes of thought, which he said after the game he thought it was winning, but he missed something later on. But this actually allows the knight to come back to c7 now, because I have the b5 square, and this is just going to be a draw. So we'll see what happens in the game. But what he should play is just king takes d5. And the reason I played knight a8 is that here I would have knight b6 check, and then I can take on a4. But white is just winning the race. Plays c4, and the point is after a5, he's going to play king b5, and he's going to make sure this pawn doesn't go any further, basically. So after knight b2, he would play c5. After a4, white would play king b4, stopping a3. And this pawn is just out of range of the knight, and white's going to promote. The king is going to be outside the square also, so white's going to win pretty easily. And there's really actually like nothing else to calculate. I mean, after c4, like, if this knight, if I don't play a5, like, what can I do? I can move my knight somewhere, but either way, like here, I can still play c5. And after a5, this will transpose here for king b4. If I play like knight c3, then white just plays d5. Like, it's pretty easy to see that like after knight e4, d6, this is not really going to work. This pawn is already threatening to go to d7 when it's going to promote. If you sacrifice and play a5, I think like white can just come back and pick this pawn up and then promote this guy. So yeah, that line seems like a pretty straightforward win. But what he played a5 lets me write back. So I play knight c7, king d6, knight b5. We got this. And he thought he was winning here after king c6. But I already had figured out this was a draw. So basically, like, it looks like this pawn is going to be able to advance, and his king is going to be able to, combine threats of this promoting with taking on a7. And then if you take on a7, then definitely white is winning because this pawn will be way too hard to stop. But actually, I calculated here that white's not even threatening anything, and I just play the very calm move h5, which I think is the easiest way to draw. So just making sure white has no plan here of making a passed pawn with g4, g5, because my king will be needed over here in the defense. And it turns out that white simply has no way to make progress. If he plays a6, with the idea king d7 and king takes a7, you're just not going to be able to take it. After king b7, I'll play knight b5. I'm threatening d5, so I'm threatening the d pawn. Play d5, and my king comes over. And if you attack my knight, the knight just goes back. And like, at this point, I mean, if you play king b7 again, I could always come back to b5. I think at this point you also could just take this, because after king takes a7, there would be knight to b4. And it will sacrifice itself for this pawn, and actually, like, white has to be careful. White actually might be losing that, because black's king is closer to the king side. So that doesn't really work. What he ends up playing is d5, but now my king is time to come back. d6, king f7, d7, king e7, and he realized here that if he continues with king c7, I will actually play knight b5 check. Not knight d5 check, because then I think king c8, and I can't stop him from promoting. But knight b5 check. And like if you try to play king c8, then I play knight d6 check. In fact, this position could even be winning for black, because I get my knight to f7 and I'll blockade this. So yeah, he definitely doesn't want to experiment with that. But yeah, like this would be a draw. And if he tries to play in this position, if he tries to play g4, then both sides will end up promoting. So like this is the line that I calculated, and I'll promote. He will promote with check on d8, so that he can promote with check on h8, and he'll take my knight. And finally, after like a very long game with crazy material imbalances, we've reached this equal material queen and pawn endgame, which definitely should be a draw. So yeah, I think we both saw this in our calculations, and he just offered a draw after d7, which I was very happy to accept because I had been losing for most of the game. So I was like, okay, yes, let's just take a draw. So yeah, I think probably the most instructive point in this game was this plan that I missed, or yeah, that plan that I didn't really go for back from the opening, like right around here, where after he plays this f4 move, it's kind of clear that white is going to set up this kingside pawn storm with g4, or at the very least he's going to try to put some pressure on me over here and attack my king if I castle this way. And yeah, the right way to meet this would be to play the Leela plan here, like h5, castles g6, and just leave the king, like on e8, not even castle, because the rook is very useful on the h file to stop this plan from white to play g4. And basically a position like this, like it looks like white has very active pieces, it looks very scary, but black is very solid. There's no sacrifices, everything is defended, the rook comes to e8, and black is going to start to improve his position very slowly. Play f6, then yeah, like I said, just slowly maneuver a knight towards e4, black can slowly play on the queen side like this, and white really can't do anything. Like the main point is there's no pawn breaks for white to improve his position. So yeah, I think it's just very instructive to see how you can play this way. So kind of castling looks like a natural move, like it seems like you have to castle, but yeah, these automatic moves, you don't always have to just play them without thinking. So in this case, castles was a mistake. So yeah, then there were definitely a lot of adventures later where yeah, he sacrificed a knight, or sacrificed both of his knights for a rook and some pawns. And he was definitely winning, like he had several chances to win, and luckily he did not take advantage of them. Yeah, and then just kind of at the end, this is a very funny roundabout way that my knight was holding the draw here. So like once we got to this position, this knight, like by the way, earlier in the endgame it had gone to d6 to c8, then e7, then ends up on g8. And actually earlier, remember, it had played knight h8 to defend against like these queen g6 threats. Then from h8, yeah, it went to like f7, then to d6, c8, e7, g8, and then later it went to it went f6 to e8 and to c7 to a8, then back to c7, then yeah, over here to b5 and c3. So this knight kind of single-handedly saved my whole position. So definitely, I'll definitely try to remember the crazy knight moves that I was able to accomplish here. So yeah, seems like the king should be the stronger piece here in the endgame, but no, this knight. So I'm gonna be a little more than just 3 points here. I'm gonna be pretty much holding together this entire part of the board on my own. So, all right, so that'll do it for this game. One last game from this tournament, I won pretty convincingly against an FM, so that will be the next game I'll analyze. And until then, yeah, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching, and yeah, take care.